Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your phones off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speaker during his presentation or after his presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming dear Professor Brian Miller. Brian Miller is a professor of accounting at the Indiana University. Professor Miller research focused on decision making by various capital market participants involved in reporting and using financial statement information, including managers, board members, and investors. His work has been published in top-ranking journals in accounting, such as the Accounting Review, the Journal of Accounting and Economics, Management Science, Contemporary Accounting Research, and the Review of Accounting Studies. He serves as an associate editor at Management Science and on the editorial board at several other top ranking journals. He is also the recipient of the awarded American Accounting Association's notable contribution to accounting literature award. Now we will start our seminar with dear Professor Brian Miller.
Thanks, Mohammed. It was great to get to chat with you a little bit earlier today, and really excited for this opportunity. This seminar has grown over this time. You know, you've led this for 3 years, and I really consider it a badge of honor to be able to present here. You've kind of grown something really unique, and so thank you for this opportunity. And excited to present this paper. So this is a really new paper for all of us. First time that we've presented it. Actually, we're still kind of working on it on a daily basis here. And so the paper's titled "Escaping the Sinking Ship: Undisclosed SEC Investigations and Voluntary CEO Turnover." And it's with my fellow professors, Eric Holtzman and Joe Schrader here at Indiana University. And then the paper was actually started by Jasik Kim, who's a fourth-year PhD student at Indiana. Jasik will be on the market not this year, but next year. He's doing a great job, and we're excited to work with him on this project. And so I want to make a quick note. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on the attendance list here, and I appreciate you all showing up. A couple of people have reached out to me and said, "Hey, is the paper public yet?" And it's close to being public. So I'm going to kind of discuss it today. We haven't actually posted it publicly yet. We're still trying to clean up just a few minor things, but we hope to publish that soon, and we'll publish that on SSRN. So hopefully you can look out for that in the coming weeks here. So here's basically the story. I've worked a lot on executive penalties around restatements and fraud, and auditor penalties around restatement and fraud, and we kind of know that people tend to get fired when they're involved with fraud. Probably not that surprising to us, and it kind of depends on how we measure restatements and we measure fraud and those things, and so there's some variation in those things. But what we haven't really studied a lot, at least to my understanding, is managers face this impending turnover. Do they try to escape the ship early and jump to a new job before they get fired? And does that allow them then to kind of avoid some of these career penalties? And so that's kind of the story of our paper. A lot of studies have focused really on this forced turnover and these penalties. And we're trying to see, if you leave before things get bad, are you able to kind of escape some of those penalties and escape and find yourself a new job and basically continue with the successes of your CEO path? And so this has been a growing literature. Terrence Blackburn, phenomenal job finding this, working with the SEC and getting this FOIA data on SEC investigations. And so really clever work. And I've got a couple papers and owe Terrence deeply for his work in this area and being able to identify these SEC investigations. And the key to this data that Terrence was able to get, and I'm referencing here this Blackburn, Kepler, Quinn, and Taylor paper, which is kind of the first in this area using this data. But the key to this data is, before we could only see disclosed SEC investigations. So the firm decided to disclose it, or if there's an AER, we could kind of look backwards and say that this firm was under investigation. But we could never really see what firms were under investigation that didn't disclose before. And so provides a really cool opportunity, especially in our setting, to kind of say, hey, there's these investigations. CEOs are kind of, may see the writing on the wall is coming, but maybe it hasn't been made public yet. And so are they able to, jump ship and kind of escape some of these career penalties? So it allows us, basically, at bottom line, allows us to view these firms that are under investigation that haven't been publicly disclosed yet. So just kind of a little bit of background on this publicly disclosed data, or the SEC investigation data. So the Blackburn et al. Paper, estimates that about 11% of companies are actively under formal investigation by the SEC. That's a pretty significant number, and I think a pretty important finding to the research, that there's a lot of SEC activity going on behind the scenes. Further, study indicates that about 19% publicly disclose it. So they find out that they're under investigation, they immediately disclose it. And only 45% of those firms actually even ever eventually disclose that they're under an SEC investigation. And so that means almost half, or a little bit over half, are under an SEC investigation, but they don't disclose. And that kind of provides us with an opportunity here again in this setting. So that ability to not disclose something, the firm elects not to disclose it, and the CEOs can then seek new employment before the investigation is leaked or disclosed by the SEC. So again, kind of circling back, one of the kind of unique aspects of our study that I think is important to both the accounting and the finance literature is that most of the time we're focused in our literature on forced turnover. And a lot of times we might report what voluntary turnover looks like, but usually it's not a big part of what we're looking at. And so you go back to a long literature on this, but in particular this Hewson, Perino, and Stark's 2001 study, some of the earlier studies here, Perino, Sias, and Stark's. Perino's kind of been a mainstay in this literature, and this ability to distinguish between forced and unforced turnover. We've kind of followed that up. Hennes, Leone, Miller, a paper that I've worked on, looks at restatements and turnover around that. Although we don't formally tabulate the forced turnover, in some footnotes, we show that we basically get the same results in the forced turnover, and that it's not really voluntary turnover driving our results. And then, a very seminal paper in the fraud literature, this Karpov, Lee, and Martin paper, where they discuss the fact that managers face significant consequences and are often fired for their involvement in AEER. So kind of the Hennes, Leone, Miller focuses on the irregularities, the important restatements that kind of where there's suspected fraud, and then the Karpov, Lee, and Martin more focus on the AEERs, where there's fraud has been kind of detected and the company's been formally prosecuted in terms of an AER at least. I'll give you a quick overview of the results, and then we'll kind of get into some of the details as we go along here. So basically the key finding here is that the CEOs tend to voluntarily leave the company when there's an undisclosed SEC investigation. If the SEC investigation is disclosed by the company, they tend to be forcefully removed. If it's undisclosed, they're more likely to leave. And that's great that they leave, but where do they go from here? And so in the next set of tests, we look and find that those CEOs that leave tend to get rehired by other firms. And then we'll kind of show where they get rehired, that they get rehired into similar positions, and that they get similar salaries and these kind of things. And so, two kind of findings that are important for us around there. One is that they don't face the same penalties. We can see that the CEOs that leave in disclosed investigations, that they face pretty significant penalties, in the sense that they're not rehired at the same rates. They have a lower likelihood of being rehired than the ones at undisclosed. And then in addition to that, we basically don't find much of a difference at all between the rehiring rates of people involved in these undisclosed SEC investigations relative to just normal people that leave their jobs and are rehired. And so we kind of, our takeaway from those combination of findings is that the managers are able to kind of escape the immediate penalties and kind of find new employment. And then the final thing that we look at, and there's plenty of other things that are interesting, and I'm interested to hear what other people are interested in about this paper and other avenues to go down. But we wanted to see whether this kind of whether being tainted by this SEC investigation. So the SEC obviously knows that these people were involved in these investigations and that they left and they went to a new firm. And so does that increase the SEC kind of following the CEO to the new firm? And then are they more likely to be investigated at that new firm once they've moved to that new firm? Does that make the new firm a new target? So that's kind of the overview of results. Kind of they escape the sinking ship. They go on to similar type jobs, and the SEC tends to follow them or track them a little bit tighter, it appears, as those new firms are more likely to be under SEC investigation in the future. Nathan, good to see you.
Brian. Super cool paper. I really like the results that you have here. And I was kind of curious a little bit about this notion that the CEOs hold a ton of stock, or on average hold a lot of stock in their companies. Have y'all looked at because in some ways this could be perceived as like an optimal or efficient decision by them to voluntarily leave with the investigation, because then maybe they could kind of hide it a little bit better if they're still in office. Is there any way to interpret that based on what they're holding, and if maybe their holdings or the value of what they hold play some sort of role in what decision that they're making for their company?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've touched on this a little bit in terms of their compensation packages, about whether they would want to leave and kind of get rehired at a new firm and stuff. We haven't done probably as much as we could, and I agree it's super interesting. So you've got this tension. If you leave, maybe you're giving up on options and other vesting and all this kind of stuff. And so it actually adds a little bit more tension probably to our paper, just, hey, you just leave and you go to get a new job. That kind of makes sense. But I like this avenue of maybe for certain CEOs that's really challenging for them to do. So in our very last table, we kind of look at who stays and who goes. I think it's maybe table 12, and we'll kind of touch on that at the very end. But maybe that's an important thing to kind of pull up in our analysis and kind of think through a little bit more. Some of the other things that we've thought about are you a good performer? If you're not a good performer and you have this SEC investigation, maybe you don't have other opportunities, right? And so kind of some of that stuff. But I do think that that's important. And we've touched on it a little bit. We've kind of buried it all the way at the end of the paper. But Nathan, maybe it's something that we need to pull up more and make more prominent.
I like the idea of the tension discussion with it, because I think that does build some of that tension. But I think even just trying that as even potentially like a cross section could help get inside that black box of what they might be thinking at this point. I think it's tough to treat them all homogeneously because they all have very different set of circumstances. I think the ability discussion that you just had there is perfect too, because they all have different abilities to go find a new job at this point. If you're a low performing executive, you're probably not going to have that same ability as a high performing, but potentially you have this opportunity to get inside the black box if you could look a little bit into what their incentives may be to stay at that point.
Yeah, I love it. That's really great. I think that makes the paper a little bit more rich. I think that the second and third findings here to me are pretty interesting. The first one, I'm kind of, I think it's interesting to me that the empirical measures kind of work the way that they should in some ways, but probably not a ton of tension. And I think you're right that we could add to the story a lot more and say, hey, your incentives would be to stay where you're at in a lot of these cases. Why do you take on the cost to leave and go to a new firm? And maybe you don't if you've got a big pay package that's coming due, or you're vesting and things like that. So it's great. Mark, good to see you.
Hey, Brian, from afar.
Yeah, you're across the street at least. So
I'm across the street. Curious, I don't know the SEC investigation, Blackburn data that well, but what level of granularity kind of do you have in terms of what's actually going on with the investigation? And what I'm thinking, just brainstorming, is like if there's any way you can get at like to what extent the CEO may be more or less involved in whatever the investigation's related to. And I'm not sure if I have a specific prediction, but just wondering if, say, it's more or less related to, or the CEO more or less has his or her hand in the related to the issue, if that affects the voluntary decision at all.
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Mark. The data basically just shows that, hey, this firm's under investigation from this date to this date. And so we still have quite a bit of a black box here in terms of what we can and can't see or observe. Now, there's probably, other opportunities to, maybe ex post kind of look back. We've done some work on like throwing out the ones that have AERs or something where that maybe that they know, hey, we know it's coming kind of deal. The writing's on the wall. We know that we're going to get in trouble here. And that we kind of find the same result there after we throw those materiality ones out. But that materiality piece is an important concern to us, and we've touched around it a little bit in this paper so far, but we really haven't probably done enough to kind of think about those factors that you're raising, Mark.
Great. I see Phil's here, so you'll get so much better.
Yeah, exactly. I'm excited to see
Yeah.
Phil. Nice. Hey, Phil, how are you?
Good. Good to see you, Brian. I'll see you in about a month, I guess, at Cars.
Yeah.
So Terrence was able to get what the SEC's investigation was about. I don't know to what extent he's sharing that, but I know he is for sure sharing the investigations that relate to insider trading and those that don't. And the ones that relate to insider trading almost exclusively relate to things happening outside the firm. These aren't investigations into the CEO. And so probably for a decent chunk of those observations, it seems unlikely that the CEO has anything to do with those. And I think if you email Terrence, I think he's providing those right now. Otherwise, you might be able to FOIA the SEC to find out what the primary cause of the investigations is, because there's certainly, like Mark said, there's some investigations that would be in the purview of the SEC and others that where the SEC is not looking at anything that's related to the CEO, but it's going to have the firm's name attached to that investigation.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So they're just kind of caught somebody else is doing some trading around their stock or something, and the management team doesn't have any fault, but they would be flagged in the way that we're measuring things right now.
Yeah, so they're sometimes called TISO, so trading the securities of, and sometimes it might say Apple Inc., but it's the auditors, the staff auditors of Apple that are doing the trading. So it's not even anyone at the company, or it could be a hedge fund. And so those would probably add noise to what you're doing. Question I had is how you figured out who leaves voluntarily. So when Terrence and I were working on our paper together, just the two of us, that's in the accounting review earlier this year, we did look at CEO turnover, but we had a hard time figuring out which CEOs left on their own accord and which were pushed out, essentially, because sometimes there isn't public disclosure that we're firing this person. The person's just told, hey, we'd like you to leave right now. And so it seems like in this setting, it's difficult, given the private information of the investigation, to know who's leaving on his or her own accord and who's just kind of being pushed out, for example.
Yeah, so I think it's always challenging, and granted, it's maybe even increasingly challenging in this setting. And so what we're doing here is we're just following the Perino measures. And so basically, if it says forced out, we're taking that as a forced, and we're kind of using what's left over as a voluntary. The other way that they kind of decide stuff, if you say you're retiring, but you're less than 60, is that really a retirement? If and I've got a list of them here in a couple slides, but the other one is, you announce your retirement and it's immediate versus like there's a longer term. It's 100% noisy. I think that's actually why I go back and I said what's sort of interesting to me is that it actually works as well as it does in these next couple tests that I'll show. the distinction between forced and voluntary, because those measures are pretty noisy. But we've kind of done our best based on what prior literature's done on this forced and voluntary cut, but certain open and so honest that there's some shortcomings there, and then open to any suggestions that people might have.
Yeah, it seems like it's consistent with this idea that if this SEC or if the CEO gets ahead of the news, then the CEO can kind of set his or her own path. Whereas if there's a public firing or if the investigation is leaked, then the CEO is more restricted in future labor market opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe we need to, I think in our writing so far, we've kind of made it seem a little bit more exogenous to the CEO, that it's like, oh, they're able to kind of sneak away. And I think my view is probably more in line with what you're saying, that they kind of maybe molding the whole thing, depending on the power that they have with the board and some other things to not disclose, and then, be able to kind of leave quietly. So yeah, I think that those are great points. Thanks, Phil. Appreciate your feedback. Mohammed?
Thanks, Brian. Very interesting paper. I have a question about, are you focusing only on the CEO turnover, or are you looking at the top management team? Because CFO would be highly involved in things like these, and I'm not sure if you have included that. Usually these two together goes hand in hand. And
Yeah. And if one leaves, maybe the other one's able to save their job, etc. This is kind of our first cut at the data and kind of writing up this draft, and so it's definitely something that we've chatted quite a bit about. But we were right now, partially because of the hand collection on the forced and unforced stuff, we kind of focused a lot more on the CEO. But it's something that we're looking into the CFO. We haven't really incorporated that into the paper yet. I think my gut is that it's those two and not probably the broader team. But I agree, from some prior work, Andy Leone's got a paper that, you can kind of scapegoat if you're a founder, you can kind of scapegoat the CFO and kind of protect your own job. And so there may be some of that going on here too, which would be super interesting to see. And
also, is there any discussion about the age of the CEO at the time that they are doing that turnover? Is that like they have a longer period inside the firm? Have you control to the previous investigation of the same firm? And also, when they move from one firm to another, are they going to a troubling firm as well, or are they going to a firm that is fresh and they don't have any problem, and then you find that they already in an investigation? So previous experience, I'm not sure if you had a time to control for that.
Yeah, so a couple of great points here. So the age of the CEO, really for us, I think we control for it in our main tests. And then we do some subsequent analysis to see who leaves and who goes, like a little bit of a determinants type model. And in that determinants model, we look at tenure, like at the firm, at how long they've been there, to kind of see how that affects their decision. I believe that the way it goes is that the longer you've been here, the less likely you are to leave. But I may have that result flipped, so we'll get there on table 12. I don't remember exactly which way it goes, but I think it's that way. And then the second point that you raised, help me remind me what the second point was. I didn't get that one written down. Oh, you're still on mute. Sorry, buddy.
I asked about the CEO age as well as the troubling firm. So if they are actually
right.
investigation or not, and when they move, do they move to a troubling firm or
So something we probably could do more with right now. We've kind of done this difference in difference design, so we've controlled for the pre-period, which would kind of show if they have investigations, and then what the incremental effect of this would be. So if they're a firm that was already getting investigated a lot beforehand, and then they continue to get investigated, we would kind of flush some of that out in that difference in difference design. But it's important for us to continue to make sure that that's not the case, that they're just leaving to go to bad firms and then trouble just kind of follows them because trouble was already there because they don't have any better job opportunities. Great questions. Thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our research design here. In our first set of tests, we just look overall at CEO turnover. The CEO turnover, where we look at whether the SEC is investigating them, and then we have a series of governance controls, firm controls. There's some industry fixed effects in and some year fixed effects in. And the important part here again is this SEC investigation data, which Phil and Terrence have worked a lot on, and they actually have better data, as time goes on. And so I appreciate that comment from Phil earlier. Basically, we just have an indicator set to 1 if the firm year was under investigation by the SEC and 0 otherwise. And one of the big things here is that these investigations aren't just random, right? And so kind of going back to Mohammed's point, maybe these are just troubled firms to begin with, and troubled firms, the CEOs are more likely to leave anyway. And so, it's just kind of a coincidence or a correlated omitted variable that we're getting the SEC investigation data. And so to try to deal with that, we basically look at some probability or likelihood that a firm would be under SEC investigation, and we build up a likelihood score for that, and then we match on that likelihood score. So what we do there is we go to the Holtzman et al. Paper from 2023. It's forthcoming at JEE. So this is Holtzman, Marshall, and Schmidt. And you can see the determinant models on the right-hand side of this slide. Number of patents, did they beat their forecast? All these different items, both in terms of regulatory non-compliance, their private sector scrutiny, the public trigger events, and then several controls that they have. We use column 5 of their analysis to build that match there. All right, so what do we find? Well, in this basic univariate statistics sense, we show that they're really the matching worked, right? In the top row, there's no difference, at least in the first and second moments here, across those two, or statistical significant difference, I should say. And then as we go through, these other factors basically show what does turnover look like in the 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, and you can see that firms are more likely to, CEO turnover is more likely if there's a SEC investigation than if there's not. And that, I would say, this finding overall is just consistent with the prior work from 10, 20 years ago kind of deal, that we know if a firm's in trouble and being investigated, that they're more likely to be, to have CEO turnover at those firms. And so again, that's this first test. We just drop this in with all the governance and firm controls, and we basically find the same thing, that if you're involved in an SEC investigation, you're more likely to turn over. I think what was more interesting to us is again, this ability to find this disclosed and undisclosed investigation data. And so we follow the Blackburn et al. Kind of methodology here. We actually cross-check our data back to their data, trying to search the SEC filings, press releases, media articles, anytime where we can find that there's evidence that this investigation has been disclosed. We also look, I've got another paper with Coleman et al. In management science, and there we show that the SEC can or investors or other stakeholders or interested parties can ping the SEC and basically determine to a pretty good extent whether the firm is actually under investigation or not. And so if that's true, then even though it's not publicly disclosed by the company, there's a pretty high likelihood that investors know that the firm is under SEC investigation. So we kind of use a combination of those two things to kind of find our undisclosed SEC investigations. So we define those as the investigations that are not disclosed, are defined as the undisclosed investigations. And so when we do that, this is again just overall CEO turnover. So we haven't gotten into the forced and unforced stuff that Phil and I were chatting about a few minutes ago. But you see, basically you get very similar turnover between both the disclosed and the undisclosed. They're at least not statistically significant. As you go out, the disclosed turnover kind of still keeps turning on. The results get a little bit weaker for the undisclosed, maybe suggesting that the undisclosed investigations either are fired or they tend to leave earlier on before it kind of becomes public. Yeah, Phil?
So one of the things that Terrence and I did is we split the disclosed data into those that were disclosed by the company versus those that were disclosed or leaked by a third-party journalist. Have you thought about splitting where the disclosure comes from? Because we found in our accounting review paper that that was a key determinant of CEO turnover.
Yeah, we need to do some more of that work. We haven't done any splits like that, Phil. So we need to kind of jump on that a little bit tighter for sure. Thanks. All right, so this is kind of the answer to your earlier question, Phil, about forced and unforced turnover, and basically looking at, Peters and Wagner are kind of the more recent version of this, but Perino kind of was the start of this, trying to ferret out what's forced, what's unforced. So press reports indicate that CEO is fired or forced out or retired due to policy differences or board pressures. Turnovers below the age of 60, they don't report the reason is due to poor health or death or acceptance of another position. And the CEO, what articles report they're retiring, but they're kind of retiring immediately. So usually these things say, to spend more time with family or something like that. And so that's kind of where we're at with that group there. So what we do is basically define the forced turnover consistent with this prior literature. And then we look at the voluntary turnovers as those that aren't defined as forced. And so again, not perfect by any means, but we are able to follow that prior literature. And basically this is the results from that. So I'm going to actually flip the tables as they show in our recent paper. But the CEO forced amounts are the disclosed SEC investigations. You can see the forced turnover turns on pretty significantly, right? You see in this top row here, the SEC disclosed investigations turn over more in both the 6 month, 12 months, and 24 months relative to the undisclosed SEC investigations. So that's, again, like what we would expect, I think, from prior literature as we think about that historically, at least. And Phil, I admit I need to take a better look at your recent paper and make sure that we're doing a good job of giving it credit and informing all of that and making the same cuts that you do as well. So in the CEO voluntary turnover set, what we find is we get these undisclosed SEC investigations. And now you see that, in the voluntary case, you don't see hardly any turnover for the disclosed SEC investigations, but you see a ton of turnover for the undisclosed SEC investigations, right? And so firms are CEOs are more likely to leave kind of voluntarily, or at least not forced out in the 6 months and 12 months following that. We tend to look and find that they tend to leave early, right? They tend to leave within that first 12 months. Again, probably being risk averse, trying to leave before things catch up with them on that dimension. But kind of going back to Phil's question, that the data kind of plays out pretty cleanly in the way that we would expect it in terms of the forced versus voluntary. At least in our setting here, it looks like the voluntary is kind of loading on the undisclosed, and the disclosed looks like it's more due to forced turnover versus the voluntary turnover. So that's encouraging for us. In our next set of tests, then we look at future employment opportunities. So we pull all turnovers between 2000 and 2013, and we look at rehire rates of CEO turnovers related to investigations to other CEO turnover. So looking at all turnovers now, and then we're going to look at the investigation data and figure out whether those firms or those CEOs are able to get rehired. In our first set of tests, we're pretty broad. So there's some discussion, did they go to bad firms? Did they go to the same level firms? And the first set of tests, we just look at overall, like, are you able to like get another job? Like, you're tainted. Are you able to get another job? I mean, you're tainted if you're disclosed. I guess you're maybe less informed that you're tainted if you're at an undisclosed one. So we look basically at the CEOs rehired, and then we look if there's turnovers during an investigation period. And we define being rehired anytime within a 3-year window. We expanded out to 4 or 5 years, and we kind of find similar results here as well. That's kind of the goal as we think about this CEO being rehired. And so in our first column here, we find that, if you're involved in an investigation, you are less likely to be rehired. Probably not surprisingly, you're tainted. That includes both the disclosed and the undisclosed. And then when we look at the disclosed investigations, again, we find that, that's driving a lot of that first column, that you're actually less likely to be rehired if you're involved in a disclosed investigation. But it appears, kind of relatively at least, if you're involved in an undisclosed investigation, that you have at least less of a penalty. I think we can clearly say that there's less of a penalty than if it was disclosed. You're able to get a new job at a much higher rate. And then, this one's a little bit more challenging. We don't find any difference between the, CEO rehiring rates of normal turnover and the undisclosed investigation data, which you can't really say too much about a non-result here, but there's no evidence that there's differences, at least between kind of normal turnover rates leading to rehiring from those that have an undisclosed investigation leading to rehiring as well. So, some of the questions earlier on, and I think that they're key, we've thought a little bit about these things, is, do they go to a valid suitor in the next position? So we look at, whether the firm's a public firm, we look at whether it's a comparable position, we look at whether it's a larger firm and whether they have kind of similar salary or bigger salaries going forward, just to make sure that, hey, they weren't just able to get some job, that they were able to get a quality job going forward. And so this first column, all about the public, and then, a similar title. Did you have a similar CEO or C-suite type title? And again, we find, evidence that they're at least more likely than those in the disclosed firms to get a similar job title. And, as you go forward, there was no, again, statistical difference between the normal turnover rates and those in the undisclosed investigation pieces of this. You go on to the next table or the next panel of these tests, and we look at the size of the firm. So are they able to, do they just go to really small firms, or do they have salary implications? And you can see, again, they're more likely to get rehired than they are if there's a disclosed, and in both the size and the salary part. And then just overall, kind of get that they're more likely to go to a bigger firm, even if they're in this undisclosed investigation, which I don't, pretty weak significance there. I don't know that I really have a strong story for that, but I think the story really is on these F tests and the differential treatment between the disclosed and the undisclosed, and did they able to get the differential penalty there. All right, so the next item that we look at is we examine whether the firms that hire CEOs that left office are more likely to experience a new SEC investigation after hiring those CEOs. And so, does this impact that they were able to leave, but obviously the SEC knows that they were under investigation, does that follow them to their new firm? So in this case, we, look at new SEC investigations, and we kind of run this difference in difference design. And so we look at whether the firm rehires this undisclosed investigations, what happened in the post period, and then this interaction to kind of get the difference in difference. And so I think Mohammed was asking a little bit earlier about, trying to control for what was going on in the pre-period. And so we're hoping, to a large extent, running this difference in difference design, that we should be able to control a little bit for the quality of the firm as they go through the process. And so here again, beginning a new investigation, investigation set to 1 if they began an investigation, and then the rehire and undisclosed investigation, that's just kind of the same as our second set of tests, where we set an indicator equal to 1 if the firm's hired what I'm going to term as a tainted CEO, even though they may not be formally tainted in the sense that it may not be publicly available, it's undisclosed, but to the SEC, at least, that they know that they were at least the CEO at the time of these other investigations. And then we set the post equal to 1 for T+1, 2, 3, or 4 years out. And we see whether, after the years that are hired, the tainted CEOs. So it's basically what we find. We find, really the difference in difference, or the interaction term, is kind of what we're after in that first column. And so you can see that they're more likely to investigate the firms where there was an undisclosed investigation, or the person was rehired at a new firm and it was related to an undisclosed investigation, that's likely to lead to higher CEO, the CEOs being investigated by the SEC in the future. We drop the main effect and put some firm fixed effects in here. We get kind of a similar difference. I'm a little bit hesitant on making too much out of the second column, because the post and the post times rehire kind of offset one another. And so there is a positive difference here, but I gotta think about that result a little bit more in that sense. Do a little bit of supplemental analysis to examine the decision to leave. And Nathan, this is kind of circling back to the stuff you wanted to see, and I stuck it all the way at the end of the presentation, so my apologies, but it's useful to know that that's of interest to you, and maybe it should be something that we pull up and that we can maybe differentiate our paper on a little bit more. John?
Hi, Brian. Very interesting paper. Could you go to the previous slide?
Sure.
Why is the adjusted R-square is so small? Is this kind of common in this literature, or?
Yeah, it's pretty common to have pretty small adjusted R-squareds here. That I agree that it's a very small adjusted R-square. Just trying to explain the SEC investigation. Overall, I guess we could probably, one thing we could do is kind of just benchmark it to, other models that are trying to predict SEC, beginning of SEC investigations, and maybe show what that's like. So, we have this Holtzman paper that kind of is focused on which firms do and don't get investigated. And so we could kind of compare it to that and make sure that the adjusted R-square is reasonable relative to that prior work, at least. All right, so we're going to look at these CEO characteristics of those that left during undisclosed investigations. Look at the CEO characteristics, CEO compensation, CEO performance, and basically try to determine, there's an undisclosed SEC investigation, who determined to stay and who decided to leave. And so here's our tenure result. You can see the log tenure. And so the longer that you're there, the less likely you are to leave. I think I got that one right, Mohammed, when I took the guess earlier on. You can kind of see their bonus percentage. So they're actually more likely to leave when they have a higher bonus percentage. When they have a lot of restricted holdings, they're less likely to leave. And then, if they're one that I kind of think is interesting, to me at least, is that, if they have better performance, they're more likely to be able to find a new job as well. All right. I'm going to go on and basically talk about my current takeaways, and then I'll go back to the chat room, which I've sort of unfortunately been ignoring a little bit. So we'll circle back to those and then see if anybody has any additional questions. So, basically our finding would say the likelihood of CEO voluntary turnover is positively related to the presence of an undisclosed SEC investigation. Need to then look at where those firms or those CEOs go. They tend to get rehired, and they tend to get rehired at similar rates to those that weren't involved in investigations, and that they are at much higher rates of being rehired than those involved in disclosed investigations. And then finally, hiring a privately investigated CEO increases the likelihood of employers likely to being investigated by the SEC. You have a lot of great comments already. Phil, I need to take a closer look at your paper for sure, because I think you have a lot of good stuff in there that we can use, and hopefully we can make sure that our contribution's clean relative to your paper as well. And so I'll need to go back and take a deeper look at that, and lots of other great comments here that I got. All right, so I think the first comment here on the chat room, so to address the classification issues, we could examine non-performance induced CEO turnover by looking at Genter and Llewellyn. That's a great advice. Frequency of forced is very low, and Genter and Llewellyn argue that many voluntary turnovers are indeed induced by poor performance. And so, yes, certainly we can kind of look at that Genter and Llewellyn paper. I'm familiar with that one as well, and try to build some of that thinking into our paper and into our classifications. Ho-Jun said firms were targeted by SEC investigations might be poor performance. So possible it defines it driven by the performance of CEO induced power. So yes, certainly. I mean, we're trying to both match them in that first set of tests. It does look like, people that leave tend to be, or voluntarily leave, tend to be kind of better performers. And so there is certainly a way to cross the test with the individual performers. So what I would say overall is that we're trying to match that away in the first stage and look at those SEC investigation likelihood, and then kind of control for things in addition to that matching. And then we kind of circle back and kind of examine some of the implications of that later on. But I do agree that the CEO performance is important. Rasha asks how we did our fixed effect measurement. I didn't run the data, so I'm not 100% sure what command they used for the industry fixed effects or the firm fixed effects, but happy to provide that offline if you're continue to be interested. My email is easy. It's just BPM, like beats per minute, at iu.edu. And so happy to follow up with you if you have further questions there. Talked about the Ho-Jun question already. Nina has a question. Does your findings on future investigations suggest that SEC views investigated CEOs rehiring as a trigger event of an SEC investigation, or future employment are in fact more likely to engage in misconduct after the CEO to join? I don't know that we can speak to that. I think it's really interesting. I actually was chatting with somebody on the way out of the office last night about this very thing. Right now, I think the only thing that we can say is that, the CEO is more likely to be investigated, whether it's that there's actual malfeasance or something going on at the new firm. Like, I don't really know, or whether it's kind of this triggering event. I don't know which one of those two things is driving it at this point. I'd be hesitant to kind of make an opinion on that, but I do think it's super interesting. And I think maybe using, some of Phil and Terrence's data to maybe parse out what the original investigations are and maybe these new investigations would certainly be helpful to tighten the tests at least on what those things that are driving it are. So feel very grateful for that comment as well. All right, I have another comment. There's a chance that you can look up SEC follow-up enforcement. Do they view the CEO leaving the firm suspicious and indicating something wrongdoing at the firm? Yeah, so I don't really know that there's a way to do that. Maybe there's better data out there that I'm aware of in terms of why they're doing it. But, you know, maybe this data that Phil and Terrence have, again, by being able to look and see whether the CEO is kind of involved in it or if it's kind of tangential to the CEO would be kind of powerful going forward there to kind of distinguish some of these stories. That's kind of probably the best that I can think of, unless somebody else has some other ideas. All right. If there's any questions, remaining questions, I'm happy to answer them. I super appreciate this. I always say when I get to present a paper, it's always much more valuable for me than I think the people coming to listen. And so I thank you all for your insights, and I always learn a ton. And so I thank you for all your comments and things as well. So I'm super grateful for all of you coming up and all of your comments as well.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Brian Miller, for your contribution and your effort. It's really an excellent presentation and excellent paper. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone joining us today, and thank you very much to take the time to present to us, dear Professor Brian Miller. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Phil, do you want me to call you with follow up?
Yeah, Terrence also has which investigations led to an enforcement action.
Okay.
Which is pretty helpful in just doing a severity cut.
Yes.
And so we didn't put our paper that ended up in TAR on SSRN. And so like the first public circulation would have been just when it was published in the accounting review.
Okay.
But yeah, there might be some things in that paper. It was published earlier this year that might be helpful to your current paper. Otherwise, just send Terrence an email. He has a Dropbox where he's sharing whatever he does share. I think, like you said, this is Terrence's data, not my data. I'm just along for the ride. But yeah, he is sharing some of it. Otherwise, you could always just go back and try to figure out what was FOIA'd and then re-FOIA that yourself.
Okay. All right. Super helpful.
Yeah, and then we'll chat at IU. Are you around for cars?
I am. Yeah, excited to see you here.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll look forward to seeing you there, and good luck with the paper.
All right, thanks, buddy. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, goodbye. And I hope to see you soon in Egypt, dear Brian. You are very, very welcome.
Let's figure that out, Mohammed. I'd love to come.
Yeah, you are very welcome. It's my pleasure.
All right, bye-bye.